Somebody's in the chair. Third-person narrative by Tony Angelo, converted to narrative form. The room was plain enough to be suspicious. No decorations, no windows, no distractions. Just a single empty chair placed dead center like it had been caught doing something it shouldn't. Mark stood off to the side with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who had already lost patience with the situation. Tony, meanwhile, circled the chair slowly, as if it owed him money, an apology, or both. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched until Mark finally exhaled. He re-established the obvious. The chair was empty. Tony countered with the less obvious. The chair was full of potential. Mark insisted it was just a chair. Tony insisted that was exactly what made it powerful. Mark reminded him it came from a garage sale. Tony declared that to be the most haunted of all possible origins. Tony leaned in, squinting at the chair as though it were hiding state secrets. He mused aloud that emptiness didn't always mean unoccupied. Mark shot back that Tony's schedule was a perfect example. Tony warned him to be careful. The chair might take offense. Both men glanced at the chair. The chair, as chairs do, remained silent. Mark called out to it experimentally. Nothing. Tony whispered that he was listening. Mark objected to the pronoun. Tony insisted there was always a he when no one answered. Then Tony produced an imaginary notepad with the seriousness of a detective on a high-profile case. He began documenting the chair's behavior. Mark demanded to know whose behavior he was supposedly recording. Tony, with great satisfaction, said, "Exactly." Tony shifted tactics, addressing the chair gently, reassuringly, as if coaxing a skittish animal. He claimed the chair felt the reassurance. Mark insisted it did not. Tony claimed the chair had tightened up. Mark crouched in front of it, eye level, attempting diplomacy. The chair remained unmoved, physically and emotionally. Tony interpreted the silence as playing hard to get. Mark interpreted it as not here. Tony explained that some individuals required a respectful, confident approach. Mark reminded him they were talking to furniture. Tony insisted confidence mattered. Mark tried again, demanding a name. The chair offered none. Tony and Mark agreed this was rude. Tony escalated to a formal interview posture, asking for name, occupation, and reason for sitting. The chair declined to participate. Tony called it coy. Mark called it non-existent. Tony placed a hand on the chair as if greeting an old friend. Mark warned him he was getting too comfortable. Tony claimed he was establishing rapport. Mark reminded him that furniture was not known for its expressiveness. Tony disagreed. Tony then sat across from the chair, crossing his legs like a therapist settling in for a long session. He asked how long the chair had been in this chair. After a pause, Tony nodded thoughtfully, claiming the chair implied a long time. Mark argued the chair implied nothing but silence. Mark began pacing, diagnosing the situation as avoidance. Tony agreed. Emotional availability was low. Mark concluded they were being ghosted. Tony corrected him. They were being seated and forgotten. Mark admitted that was worse. Tony leaned in close to the chair, whispering encouragement. He declared the chair guarded. Mark declared it empty. Tony said those were sometimes the same thing. Finally, Mark snapped. He pointed at the chair, announcing they were done waiting. He leaned in, demanding the chair say something, anything. He caught himself mid-sentence, frustrated by the absurdity of the demand. They stared at the chair again. The silence grew heavier, as if the chair were somehow contributing to it. Tony whispered that he felt the tension. Mark insisted it was just them talking to a chair. Tony insisted it was mutual. Then Tony froze. Something had changed. He announced gravely that the chair's occupant had left. Mark argued that nothing had moved. Tony said that was what made it convincing. Mark looked around the room, then back at the chair. He called out, "Sir?" and declared the occupant still present. Tony insisted the energy had shifted, the kind of shift that meant someone was not here anymore. Mark, fed up, sat in the chair himself. Tony gasped as if Mark had violated sacred ground. Mark argued the seat was open. Tony accused him of disrespecting the original occupant. Mark reminded him there was no original occupant. A long, heavy beat. Tony asked quietly, "Then who had they been talking to?" Both men froze. Mark answered slowly, "Themselves." Tony agreed, in front of a chair. Mark added, "With commitment." Tony nodded, processing the revelation. It explained the lack of response. Mark agreed. Tony patted the chair gently, offering a farewell. He declared it a good listener. Mark disagreed. Tony insisted it never interrupted. Mark said that didn't make it a good communicator. They gathered their things and headed toward the door, both still irritated with the chair's non-existent manners. Tony admitted the chair had presence. Mark agreed, an impressive amount for someone who wasn't there. At the doorway, Mark wondered aloud if the chair's occupant would return. Tony said he doubted the occupant had ever arrived. They exited. The chair remained alone in the center of the room, unchanged, unbothered, unoccupied, or perhaps very occupied, depending on who you asked. A long pause. From off stage, Mark's voice drifted back. He was rude, though. Tony's voice followed, extremely. Lights out.